Hello everybody, today I'm going to show you how to make a very easy pirate themed cake. All the materials as well as the recipe I used for this cake will be listed down in the description box. Please, if you're watching for the first time, don't forget to subscribe and give me a like. And if you already do, thank you so much. And we're going to get started. I baked my cake in a 9x13 pan. This is a chocolate cake recipe. It's very dense. I will be listing it down below. I went on the internet and I found a shape of a skull that I liked. And I traced it. I made a board for the cake as well as a template. I'm using my cake board as my template to cut out the shape of the cake. Remember to always use utensils that you only use for your cakes and for nothing else. And to take your time carving because you can never put back, but you could always cut more. This chocolate cake recipe is very simple. It's nice and dense. It's perfect for carving, and it's a recipe where you basically just put all your dry ingredients in one bowl and you add your liquids and you're done. Here I'm using the cake leveler to cut through my cake. I can never cut my cake straight, so I always use the cake level. And I'm also using chocolate Swiss meringue buttercream for the filling. I absolutely love the Swiss meringue buttercream. It's very easy. It's not as sweet as regular American buttercream, and it's much faster than making a regular Swiss meringue buttercream. I got the recipe from the Sugar Geek show from Liz Merrick. She shows you how to make this Swiss meringue buttercream, and it's delicious. So don't forget to go and check her out as well for the recipe. Here I cut out the eye sockets, the mouth, and the nose, and I'm saving those pieces because I'm going to use them later to do the fondant, make the fondant cutouts of it. And here I'm very carefully again using only utensils that I use for my cakes, carving out these parts. Once I was happy with the carving, I crumb coated my cake and set it in the refrigerator for a couple of hours before proceeding to its final coat. Now that my cake is chilling in the refrigerator, I'm going to move on to make all the fondant details for the cake. These are going to be the gold coins. I rolled out regular Wilton fondant and I added Tylose powder or CMC powder to it. What this powder does, it makes the fondant harden much quicker than it would on its own, but it's not a necessary thing to do. You could do this a couple of days ahead of time and it'll still dry. Here I'm cutting out little tiny circles, and then I'm using these fondant letter cutters to indent the letters on the circles, making sure that I'm just pressing them enough for you to be able to see the letters but not going all the way through. Once they were dry, I dusted them with gold luster dust. Now moving on to the swords that go on the sides of the pirate, I'm mixing a little bit of black with white fondant to make a gray color. I'm also adding the Tylose powder, and I'm also dusting it with cornstarch because it was very sticky. It was a hot and very humid day. I rolled out my fondant fairly thick and I let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes before I started cutting into it. I'm also using a template. The reason I'm using a template is to keep both sides as similar as possible, and also so they could fit on my board. And using templates, it just makes it easier to get things done faster. That's what I think. So again, this piece of gray fondant has been sitting out in open air at least 15 minutes before I started cutting into it. The reason I let my fondant sit for a couple of minutes before cutting into it is so when I start cutting my shapes or my pieces on the fondant, the fondant doesn't stretch as much and it loses its shape. Realistically, I should have done this also for the top part, but I rolled it out again and it wasn't so bad. Once I had cut out all my shapes for my sword, I really wanted my sword to look nice and shiny, so I used a edible silver color paint to paint my parts. I did 2 coats for each part, and before my paint fully dried, I added the top handles on the top part of the sword. It was since the wet the paint was still wet, it was enough to adhere all my pieces together without having to use any edible glue or water. I set these aside and let them fully dry before I put them on the cake. To make the map, I rolled out a very thin piece of fondant, and I also added Tylose powder to this. I basically just tore all the edges of this fondant piece and then scrunched it together. I wanted it to look like old and tethered and breaking apart. And now looking back, I really wish that I would have colored this maybe like an ivory color or a very light brown color. So when I went to dusting it, it would have given the effect of a very old map. But I still like how it came out. I dusted all my edges with this brown, it's like kind of a brown glittery luster dust, and it came out pretty cute. And now I'm using these edible food color markers to write the X marks the spot and to make the little dash lines. I also added a couple of landmarks. For example, I added the little blue water landmark, and I added a number 3 for the age of the birthday boy. And I also tried to make a couple of what's it called, of palm trees, but they came out looking like blobs. Overall, I was very happy with the map. And sometimes you make mistakes and you can't really like go back and redo them again, but it's a learning process. Once my cake was chilled for a couple of hours, I continued by adding the last and final coat and then adding the fondant on top, doing it very carefully in a section at a time, making sure that I pressed on the mouth and the eye sockets to get those features out, and also trying to take out all the air bubbles that were created while putting the fondant in, and moving a section at a time. The fondant recipe I'm using is also a Liz Merrick recipe. She basically uses a half marshmallow fondant, which is homemade, and she uses half store-bought fondant, mixes it together. I've been using this recipe for a very long time. It's also a money saver because you're not using 100% store-bought fondant. You're making your own fondant, so you're saving money, as opposed to using only store-bought fondant that could get pretty expensive. For the bandana, I use modeling chocolate. The reason I use modeling chocolate and not the fondant that I had already made is because I didn't want to sit there adding a bunch of food dye to white colored fondant and hoping that it will get the nice rich red in time for me to be able to use it. So I just opted out to make modeling chocolate instead. All you have to do is buy the wafers. I'm using Wilton candy melts, and I added the corn syrup, and voila, it's done. It's ready to use in a day or two, and you don't have to worry about using a bunch of food dye that's gonna make your fondant taste disgusting. I did the same thing I did for the gray piece of fondant. I rolled out this black fondant a couple of minutes ahead before I started cutting into it. So when I started cutting into it, my shapes would not lose my pieces would not lose their shapes. Here I'm making the little tie on the bandana, making little triangles, and then folding the long pieces together to make this little, I don't even know what shape this is, like this little tie shape. And I'm adding all these little black dots that the bandana had, and then putting them together and adding another little ball on top of it. Okay, you guys, this tutorial is almost over. I really hope that you guys are still with me. I know I've been blabbing on for the last almost 10 minutes. And now I'm going to start adding all the pieces that I cut out. I'm adding the strip for the eyepiece of the pirate. And I'm adding all the other small pieces, pressing them down into the little grooves to make sure that they're attaching good to each other. When it came to the mouth part, I didn't really like how those upper pieces looked, so I just ended up cutting them. And then I made sure that there was no air bubbles in between the white and the black piece of fondant, so I pressed it down really good. Now I'm going to continue by adding the rest of the details on the cake. I also added a gold strip on the bandana to give it more detail. I used luster dust mixed with a little bit of clear vanilla extract because that's what I had on hand, and then I continue to place all the little dots that I made on for the bandana. I mixed graham cracker crumbs with melted butter to make them look like wet sand. I also melted just regular milk chocolate, and I'm using the chocolate to basically act like as the glue to glue for the most part, the graham cracker crumbs to the board. Playing around with the placement of my upper part of the swords, determining where I want them to be placed, and then repeating the same process again of using the melted chocolate and adding the graham cracker crumbs. Another step that I thought that I filmed but I didn't get, I did add a piece of basically like a little sausage of fondant on the bottom of the blades so they could lift up off the board and the graham cracker crumbs a little bit more instead of just being laid flat on it. I also did that for the bottom portion of the blades. Using the same method for the placement of my map and the gold coins, I added little pieces of fondant on the bottom so my pieces wouldn't look like they were just laying flat on the board. I hope that you guys are still with me. I know this is a very long tutorial, but there's only so much that I could cut in order for me to be able to show you guys a process of making a cake. Please let me know, comment down below if you guys took anything from this tutorial, if it was helpful at all. Sorry that I wasn't able to show you guys how I made these little accent pieces that I'm adding to the cake. I thought I was filming it, but I didn't capture it. I do have a separate video on how to make those pearls. I have it in my potted cactus cake. Please don't forget to also follow me on Instagram at SC Cakes and More, and don't forget to give me a like. Thank you for watching.